Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien and The Sorrow of War by Bảo Ninh, which are two metafictional accounts of the Vietnam War written by authors who experienced the brutality of that conflict firsthand. Tim O'Brien was in the U.S. Army in Vietnam from 1969 to 1970, and Bảo Ninh served for the North Vietnamese forces from the late 1960s until the fall of Saigon in 1975. And in so many ways, these books are two sides of the same coin. They both excavate the traumas and memories of the ordinary soldier, and they both attempt to illuminate the impact of the Vietnam War as experienced by individuals rather than by nations or governments. And above all, both Tim O'Brien and Bảo Ninh use the act of writing itself to interrogate the question of how to tell a war story and what that means. And because of all those shared themes and ideas, I thought it would be really useful to look at these two books side by side. So I first want to talk about their similarities and the ways that they echo and inform each other, and then I want to get into some of their key differences, the ways in which they diverge and offer at times starkly different pictures of the war. The first thing I want to note about both of these books is that despite being written by veterans, they are ostensibly fictional accounts of the war. And I say ostensibly because The Things They Carried is a collection of interconnected short stories, and The Sorrow of War is a novel, but they both seem to be deeply informed by Tim O'Brien and Bảo Ninh's real personal experiences. So much of The Things They Carried reads like memoir, to the point that Tim O'Brien himself often appears as a figure in the stories, and the fact that the book as a whole is dedicated to the fictional members of O'Brien's Alpha Company makes it even more difficult to try and parse fact from fiction. Similarly, Bảo Ninh's novel is about a young fictional soldier named Kien who nonetheless shares many biographical details with Ninh, and the veil between the author and his protagonist is so thin that Ninh often slips between third person and first person, sometimes within the same sentence. And within both books, Tim O'Brien and Bảo Ninh depict themselves as writers looking back on the war and attempting to give voice to their experiences. So I think the best way to categorize these books would be to call them metafiction or autofiction, or something that falls within the realm of reality and memory and artistic interpretation. And I think it's a really effective technique on both of their parts, one that gives authority to their words while also giving them the space and the distance to do that work of remembering and interpretation. And by writing in a meta way about their writing processes, they involve you as the reader in the labor that is articulating these experiences. And much of that labor centers on their respective attempts to grapple with the question of how to tell a war story. And for O'Brien in particular, he's concerned with how to tell a true war story. And he directly interrogates those questions, saying, in any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. The angles of vision are skewed, the pictures get jumbled, you tend to miss a lot. And then afterward, when you go to tell about it, there is always that surreal seemingness, which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents that hard and exact truth as it seemed. History books so often seek absolute truths, winners and losers of conflicts, maps and casualty statistics, facts and figures. But for O'Brien, those overarching historical truths aren't nearly as important or as interesting as personal individual truths. Because for O'Brien, there is no way to truly pin down the actual facts of a moment in the life of an ordinary foot soldier. All he has left are his perceptions and his memories and the things that seem to ring true for him. And so throughout this book, he does his best to capture the texture and the seemingness of the war, and he also tries to unpin the reader's sense of truth from the opposing poles of fact and fiction. Instead, he argues that real truth is a matter of perspective. And nothing epitomizes that idea more than this passage about the death of one of his comrades, which is my favorite passage in the whole book. 20 years later, I can still see the sunlight on Lemon's face. I can see him turning, looking back at Rat Kiley. Then he laughed and took that curious half step from shade into sunlight, his face suddenly brown and shining. And when his foot touched down, in that instant, he must have thought it was the sunlight that was killing him. It was not sunlight. It was a rigged 105 round. But if I could ever get the story right, how the sun seemed to gather around him and pick him up and lift him high into a tree, if I could somehow recreate the fatal whiteness of that light, the quick glare, the obvious cause and effect, then you would believe the last thing Kurt Lemon believed, which for him must have been the final truth. And for Bảo Ninh, writing war stories is a necessity and sometimes a compulsion. He describes his fictional protagonist, who is also a writer, as feeling like these stories are his heavenly duty and his last obligation as a soldier. And he describes in such vivid ways how these war stories take on a life and energy of their own, how they break free from the bonds of traditional narrative and order to convey the fevered and chaotic truths of wartime experiences. He says, he plans the sequences in his mind, what his heroes will do and what they will say in particular circumstances, how they'll meet, how they'll part. He lays the design of this out in his mind before taking up his pen, but the act of writing blurs his neat designs, finally washing them away altogether, or blurs them so the lines become intermixed and sequences lose their order. There is a force at work in him that he cannot resist, as though it opposes every orthodox attitude taught him, and it is now his task to expose the realities of war and to tear aside conventional images. It is a dangerous spin he is in, flying off at a tangent, away from the traditional descriptive writing styles where everything is orderly. For Ninh, war is senseless. It is not coherent. It is disorienting and profoundly surreal, and the truths of war, for those reasons, cannot be contained within traditional narrative or within realistic storytelling. And interestingly, both Ninh and Tim O'Brien reject narrative realism and adopt more unconventional storytelling techniques in order to convey their truths about the war. The Sorrow of War is a long, non-linear, highly surreal stream of memory that sometimes coalesces into concrete scenes from before, during, or after the war, but often flows from recollection to recollection without any sense of distinct narrative or chronology. Ninh also sometimes employs elements of the Gothic in order to resurrect the voices and faces of the dead and to convey the tremendous sorrow of the war. The Things They Carried is less surreal, but is also non-linear and out of sequence and very fragmented, and like Ninh, O'Brien will describe the death of one comrade early in the book only to bring that soldier back again and again throughout the rest of the book. And that elliptical quality of both books, which allows certain images and scenes and characters to recur again and again, echoes the way in which the past constantly disrupts the present for these writers and how the war still rages on in their memories. But their respective styles also underscore some of the key differences between the American and Vietnamese experiences of the war. For O'Brien, the war is more jarring and disorienting, a violent disruption that's reflected in the fragmented quality of his book. For Ninh, whose homeland was seized by civil war for more than a decade, the war is inescapable and all-consuming, and his text submerges you in that unending sense of sorrow from beginning until the end. Their defining imagery of the war also presents key differences. O'Brien's American soldiers live in fear of booby traps and landmines, of jungle ambushes and the anonymous faces of lurking Viet Cong. For them, death often rises up out of the ground itself, unseen and unannounced. For Bảo Ninh's North Vietnamese, death and violence often rains down from above as faceless Americans appear in the form of aircraft that spray shells and napalm that destroy the Vietnamese landscape and villages and people. The sense of loss and and mourning is also of a different color in both of these books. For Tim O'Brien, there is an extreme sense of displacement and isolation for his soldiers, who are dropped into the jungles of Vietnam with little preparation and little idea what to expect, and then often extracted just as quickly and sent back home to cities and towns in America where few civilians can understand or fathom what they've been through. For Bảo Ninh, the loss and sorrow often extends far beyond the individual. When Saigon finally falls in 1975 and Ninh's protagonist is among the quote-unquote victors, millions of Vietnamese lives have been lost, countless villages have been razed, and the promise of a new Vietnam remains uncertain. And the extent to which the war has ravaged the lives of both soldiers and civilians is made most apparent in the doomed relationship between Bảo Ninh's protagonist and his first love, a young woman whose life is similarly broken and poisoned by the war, and who at one point laments, "What a cruel time, and so very long." For that reason, The Sorrow of War is often a heavier, slower, more arduous read, whereas O'Brien's eloquence and his phenomenal dialogue make The Things They Carried a slightly easier read. But where O'Brien's writing is perhaps more lyrical on the page, Bảo Ninh does achieve a certain poetry of his own, a sort of slow but seeping pathos that permeates the whole book. And where O'Brien sometimes has the tendency to over-explain meanings that are already self-evident, and where he sometimes ties his stories up too neatly, Bảo Ninh offers nothing in the way of relief for you as a reader, and the result is that you feel imprinted with a deep and profound sense of sorrow that is impossible to shake. But collectively, these two books paint a picture of the utter waste and devastation of war, and they illustrate how there are so few winners and so many losers in a conflict like Vietnam. And Tim O'Brien and Bảo Ninh both tried to make legible the truths and experiences that for so many of us are so impossible to fathom. Needless to say, I highly recommend both of these books, and I really encourage you to read them side by side if you get the chance to. Definitely let me know what you think about either of these books if you've read them, and if you have other suggestions for reading about the Vietnam War, I also welcome those. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!